Honourable Heather Roy.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I rise to speak to this Part 1 in the committee stage of the Misuse of Drugs Amendment Bill, and primarily I wish to speak to the Minister's supplementary order paper, but first would like to signal my disappointment from the speakers around the House. Well, not so much the disappointment in the content of their speeches, but the way that they intend to vote on particularly the Minister's SOP. There's been a lot of talk about stopgap measures, how the gazetting is going to cause a delay of 7 days before products need to be removed from shelves. Because in effect what we're doing in this SOP, Mr Speaker, is banning a substance at the moment that is legally available. And I don't think there's any disagreement about the fact that children should have access to substances of this kind. They certainly shouldn't. But if we're looking to real solutions, we first need to look to completely rewriting the Misuse of Drugs Act more quickly than it's being done, but secondly finding a solution that is workable, because, Mr Chair, we all know, and each of the speakers that have spoken so far I have heard in this House talk previously on other occasions about how prohibition does not work. My supplementary order paper, Mr Speaker, does actually look at this issue in a different way. It acknowledges the fact that adults in this country, those who are over 18 years of age, actually can make decisions for themselves. But it also puts in place actually pretty hefty measures to protect our young people. And so my SOP proposes that an age-restricted drug can only be sold to people over the age of 18, and secondly puts in place the following penalties for breaching such an age restriction. Retailers or distributors that breach the age restriction would face, after their first offence, a fine of $10,000, following a second offence, a fine of $25,000, and following third and subsequent offences, a fine of $50,000. This isn't chicken feed, Mr Speaker, and it sends a very strong signal to sellers and suppliers of chronic-like substances, or any psychoactive substance for that matter, a very strong signal that this is unacceptable behaviour. There would also be compulsory closure of premises of retailers or distributors for 7 days following the third and subsequent offences. And it does, as I say, Mr Speaker, acknowledge the fact that those who are deemed adults in this country, they can vote, they can get married, they can be sent to war, are in fact the owners of their own lives and their own bodies. There is a sense of déjà vu with this whole debate. I myself sat on the Health Select Committee when we have a number of occasions looked at the misuse of drug amendment bills, a variety of them, but I think particularly of the BZP debate. There was no regulation first with BZP. It was freely available. We then decided that it should in fact have an R18 classification, should only be available to those people who are 18 years of age and over, and then a bit further down the track banned the substance completely. When it was banned, there was, of course, as others have highlighted in the House, a raft or a wave of other similar substances that didn't have the BZP active ingredient in it that quickly came to the fore. And I see Mr Enlees Galloway shaking his head, and I'm disappointed that he's not going to support my bill, because I've also heard him speak about how prohibition doesn't work. But what the real point here, Mr Chair, is that when you ban or prohibit substances, that doesn't mean that people stop using them. What it means is their use goes underground, and a black market, usually a thriving black market, which then heavily inflates prices, builds and becomes prevalent in our society. It actually removes the ability of proper enforcement of the laws that we already have. And so those very people that we seek to protect, the under 18-year-olds, the children in our society, also have the ability, if they can find the money, and they very often can, to buy these substances on the black market themselves. And quite how the National Party or the Labour Party, the only speakers that we've heard from so far, but I suspect the other parties in this House too, how any of them believe this helps our young people and the dearth that drugs are in our society, how that helps them, I do not know. Much better to have these things above board, Mr Speaker. Mr Chair, thank you, Mr Chair. How this helps them is beyond me. I agree with the points that have been made by all speakers, I think, about a complete rewrite of the Misuse of Drugs Act. That is well overdue and should be attended to very quickly. I don't agree with all provisions in the Law Commission's report. I think that the basic principles of adults being adults and responsible for their own actions and the consequences that come with those should be much more prevalent, but protection of our young people is crucial. I think that all psychoactive substances should be covered by new legislation, and the same rules and regulations should apply to all. And I would put in this category, as we also have on our order paper in this House, the alcohol reform debate. Alcohol and drugs should be, in my view, and the ACT Party's view, looked at in the same way. Grant Robertson also raised the very good issue, the very pertinent issue of this being a health versus a crime issue, and I would agree entirely with the comments that he has made. I myself have talked a lot about the medicalisation of drug issues versus the criminalisation of them. We, following United Nations instigation over the past 40 years, have dealt with this as a crime issue, when in fact in our society it is primarily a health one. And I hope when it comes to the rewrite of the Misuse of Drugs Act that is taken into consideration, and decision-making, policy-making centres around that. He also mentioned research and testing, and of course he is absolutely right. And while we have provisions in the Minister's supplementary order paper that we have before us on the table now, when we have gazetting that allows 7 days, which will become a 7-day race, make no bones about that, a 7-day race to get things on the table before they're gazetted, and another 7 days to get them off. Research and testing is never going to happen as it should, and therefore the products that people will continue to buy, whether they're legally on shelves or bought in the black market, will never occur. And so the problems that our clinicians face at A&E departments far too often, particularly on Friday and Saturday nights, will continue when they're trying to deal with drugs that they have in many cases no idea what they are or what the active substances can contain. And so I would contend, Mr Speaker, and I'd like to ask every party, despite the fact that my SOP has come to the table very late in the day, I would like them, before the vote, to carefully consider the provisions in it. They do make sense. They allow for over 18-year-olds, adults who are responsible for themselves, to not be criminalised for buying these substances. It's much better to have them in the open rather than underground in the black market scenario, and yet still provides the safety and security of our young people, because the law would be enforceable and would be enforced in a pretty hefty way, with a $10,000 fine for the first offence, $25,000 for the second, $50,000 for the third and subsequent, and retailers or distributors that breach the age restriction would face compulsory closure of their premises for 7 days following the third and subsequent offence. The ACT Party will be opposing the Minister's supplementary order paper, but I would implore parties to think very carefully about the realities of the situations that exist. People know that the black market and driving this sort of activity underground is completely counterproductive in society. I would implore them to think carefully about putting in place sensible measures that are enforceable and get the incentives in the right place. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Honourable Damien O'Connor.
Thank you, Mr